So my grandmother grew up in Kennebunk, Maine, but she graduated from Bisbee High School in Bisbee, Arizona. And the reason for this is that she has spent her entire life in Kennebunk, Maine, but her senior year of high school, she went to Arizona for just that year and then came back. And I've never gotten a satisfying explanation for why this occurred. She says that she went to take care of some aunt who was sick, but I've never bought that. It just doesn't make sense. Did the aunt suddenly get better? Did she find another caretaker? And I've never met this aunt. I've never seen pictures of this aunt. So this has always been an intriguing bit of family lore. And the other bit that makes it interesting is that Bisbee, Arizona is such an exotic sounding place. Like Bisbee, it's a ridiculous name for a town, right? And Arizona is just exotic to a Mainer to begin with. The other interesting thing is that her high school diploma isn't printed on a sheet of paper, it's inscribed on a sheet of copper, because apparently Bisbee was a big copper mining town. So in my investigations into this mystery, one of my first investigations was when I was in my 20s, I had made plans to go on this epic road trip, the kind of great American road trip that every young American wants to go on. I would circumnavigate the country over 2 months. And I started out and I went to DC and North Carolina and Atlanta, and I went over the bridge in Selma, and I was in New Orleans for Jazz Fest, and I went to Austin and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and by the time I got out to the Southwest, I thought, aha, Arizona is right over there. I can go find Bisbee. And I concocted this plan that only my 20-something self could, that I would find Bisbee, I would find the high school in Bisbee, and I would give my grandmother a call from there and surprise her. So I plugged Bisbee into my little GPS, because this was before we used phones for literally everything, and I started driving. And I drove for hours. And my GPS took me from a highway to a 4-lane road, and then to a 2-lane road that went through the desert. And things got more and more and more desolate. Cars became rarer occurrences. Houses were further and further and further apart. Eventually, they became abandoned as I passed them every few miles. The environment around me was just desert and tumbleweeds and cacti. So at this point, in the 105-degree Arizona weather, I start to think, maybe I should have packed some emergency water for this. But I wasn't nervous because, nobody's nervous in their early 20s, and I just kept going. So eventually I come around a turn, and I see on a hillside in front of me, there's this encampment of big white tents on a hillside. And as I get closer, I realize that they're not tents at all. They are white SUVs with green stripes and emblems on the doors that say U.S. Border Patrol. And apparently, I was a lot closer to the Mexican border than I probably wanted to be. But again, this didn't bother me at all. So I kept on driving. And a car starts approaching me from the opposite direction. And it gets closer, and I see it's a white SUV with a green stripe. And it passes me, and I watch in horror in my rearview mirror as it slows down, turns around, and then starts to slowly catch up to me. Now, we've all had this feeling, right, where you're going to get pulled over. Any moment, the sirens are going to come on, the lights are going to come on, and you are going to have this experience, and it is imminent. And it sucks. So that was the feeling I had in that moment. And my first reaction was natural. It was anxiety. But my second reaction was something that really only a naive 20-something, white 20-something from a small town in Maine could have had: defiance. I decided in that moment that I wasn't going to let him pull me over. I was going to pull myself over. So without taking another moment to think about this plan, I executed it, and I put on my turn signal, and I put on my hazard lights, and I slowly pulled over to the side of the road, and I rolled down my window, and I got my license and my registration, and I looked behind me, and he had parked about 100 yards behind me. And he gets out of the driver's seat of his SUV, wearing a brown uniform, And he slowly starts to walk over. And as he is, I see that his hand is perched about 3 inches over his sidearm. And reality snapped into focus in one instant. And I thought about this from his perspective. He had just seen a random car on a road that no cars ever drive on, with plates from a state that's 3,000 miles away, with a driver that's vaguely ethnic with a 2-week beard, that had just pulled itself over, which I'm sure nobody's ever done before. So then I start to shake, and I realize I've probably made a grievous error. He gets to my car, and it all tumbles out. And I say, "Hello, officer. I'm here on a road trip from Maine, and I'm going to Bisbee, Arizona, and here's my license and registration." And I'm shaking as I do this. And he looks at it, and he says, "You're from Maine?" And the way he says it sort of implies that he doesn't know if Maine is a state or a planet. And I say, "Yes, I am, officer." And he says, "Well, where are you going?" "Bisbee, officer." "Do you know anyone in Bisbee?" And I say, "Well, no, but my grandmother used to live there." He says, "Oh, so she grew up there?" I said, "Well, no, she grew up in Maine." And we end up having this whole discussion, and he didn't believe it any more than I did. So eventually he asks me if he can search my car, and I say yes, of course, because all I had in my car was luggage, a couple granola bars, and a Maine flag that I had to bring with me. So I get out of my car, and he motions me over to stand by the SUV, and I see that his partner had gotten out, another man in a brown uniform, and I walk over, and as I am, I have a moment to take in both how lucky I was, and also how strange and beautiful this environment was that I was suddenly in. I was in the middle of nowhere. Civilization was very far away. I was surrounded by no people and just cacti and desert. So I walk over to him, and he's a darker complexion individual with a name badge that said Martinez. And for a brief flicker of a moment, I think, oh, I took high school Spanish. I should speak to him in Spanish, before I realized that I should keep my clever ideas to myself. And he says to me, "So you're from Maine?" I say, "Yes, I am." He says, "You drove here all the way from Maine?" I say, "Yes," and we have the same conversation, and he also doesn't buy it. But he lets it be, and we wait as my car is searched, and I sort of look around, and the sun is beginning to set, and everything is turning sort of light purple and pink and orange in that way that only Arizona does, and it is silent. I've never experienced silence like that since. And he must have seen the awe painted all over my face, because he says to me, "So they have mountains like this in Maine?" And I smile because I couldn't help myself, and I say, no, they don't. And eventually the other officer comes back from searching my car. He didn't find anything interesting. And he says, "All right, you're free to go. Get to where you're going." And I swear to God, he says, "Tell your grandma I said hi." So I get back in my car, and I keep driving a couple more hours, and I eventually find Bisbee, which is something like a town. It has an old 1950s tourism billboard that's all been washed away outside the town, and I find the open pit copper mine that's been abandoned for decades. And I found the high school, and I called up my grandma, and I said, "You're not going to believe where I am. Thanks."